Hello, everyone. Delighted to have you here with us today. I'm excited for this event as part of a series in conversations on the future of work. I'm excited about having Daryl here today, and I'm gonna kick it off by passing on to Sabina Mahmood, who is with us at Workview, and she will tell you a bit more about this series, about this event, and then kick off with some questions for Daryl. We're all excited about the conversation that we have ahead of us. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Zara. And, it's never a dull moment in the world of tech, no matter how advanced we are. So thank you all again for your patience. But great to see some familiar names in the chat, some new folks joining us today in a larger part of our conversations on the Future of Work series here at Workview, where we sit down with incredible leaders of industry like Daryl, who's joining us today, to talk about the impact of artificial intelligence, automation, and ultimately what work looks like for all of us as individuals, as opposed to the larger systems in play and how we can take advantage of a shared community to help us move forward. So before we jump into it, just wanted to give some context for those of you who are new to the Workview community, but ultimately what we see in terms of the world of work is a significant shift. We've heard the term future of work 10 plus years. Every year it seems to be redefined in what the future of work looks like for workers, what it looks like for organizations, what it looks like for the globe at large. And ultimately, I would say more recently, it's actually redefined almost monthly. What does it look like in terms of change and what that means for real people? So we see, Gen Z, for some of you may have seen these numbers before, but Gen Z will work 18 jobs across 6 careers in their lifetime. That's an incredible shift from where we've seen older generations that have been in the workplace, been in one role or one organization, I should say, for their entire career. And we really want to start to think about your career as a map, not just a single path. 60% or more of employers expect technological disruption by 2030. Many of us have seen this already. And up to 800 million jobs will be displaced globally. 75% of workers are ready to quit. I don't know if that resonates for anyone on the line. 40% already have a side hustle, but 25% of skills assessments are focused on employee productivity rather than values and skill sets, and understanding actually the value that each of us as individuals will bring to the workplace. So we are on a mission here at Workview to empower people to take back their purpose in the workplace and understand how they can navigate this significant shift, take on net new opportunities, and really overcome individual barriers or fears when it comes to taking that next step in terms of their workplace. So some of you on the line are part of our Future of Work Council. And for those of you who aren't, the Future of Work Council is a convening of about 15 young professionals, mid-career or so, from incredibly established backgrounds, but have all found themselves where they are through different paths, understanding different industries and different career journeys. But ultimately, we partnered with the Workview's Future of Work Council earlier this year. And just last week or 2 weeks ago now on Equal Pay Day, we launched a declaration of the future of work. So essentially 10 principles that we are committing to as a group and taking towards community to understand how we as individuals can really empower people to take on their own career decisions. And I bring this up fittingly for our conversation today, which we'll unpack shortly. But ultimately, the principles you see here on screen are largely rooted in economic security, thinking about pay inequities, fundamental barriers to success in the workplace across all demographics, marginalized groups as well, as we know there's greater exacerbations there. So I bring this up only to keep in mind as we start the conversation today. And we'll come back to it towards the end of the program and see how we can actually take this back to our desks, back to our homes, and really back to our communities ultimately from there. So I don't want to talk too much. I'm really excited, like I said, to bring in Daryl Fairweather, who is author of Hate the Game, Economic Cheat Codes for Life, Love, and Work. She's also the chief economist at Redfin. I have my copy here for any of you. We'll unblurred at the end of the session. And Daryl also, I mean, incredibly esteemed portfolio of, and definitely I would career map, not a single path across your career. I'm really excited to have you here to talk about your latest book and really thinking through economic insecurity as the backdrop of our career choices, systemic inequities, pay and wealth gaps, navigating the game, and more practically, how we as individuals can overcome some of the barriers in our own day to day. So really excited. Like I said, I think our goal for today's conversation is to keep this open forum. So if you have, we have an intimate group by design. So ultimately, if there's any questions, please feel free to add that in the chat as well, and we'll follow along as we get into it. So with that, Daryl, your book, I Hate the Game, is really working on turning economic anxiety into strategic action. I'm thinking about salary negotiations, career pivots, financial planning. I want to kick us off by getting to know you a little bit more, kind of tell us a little bit about, if you can tell us a little about yourself, your path, and really what inspired you to write the book.
Sure. Thank you, Sabina. Yeah, so I have my PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. I went to MIT for undergrad, where I also studied economics. When I first went to MIT as a freshman, I didn't think that I would become an economist. I applied as an engineer, but I've always loved math and also people. And economics presented like the intersection of those two things. It was the study of people, but through this mathematical lens. I used to think that economics was just about the stock market or about money, but it's really about how people make decisions and how all of those decisions interact with one another to form the economy. I remember when I went to MIT, my dad was really nervous about me studying economics. He thought that engineering would be safer for me because it's objective. Like if you get the equations right, no one can dispute that. If your designs are proficient, then it's just self-evident. But in economics, it really is more subjective. Economists like to think of what they study as being the subjective thing, but I think it's inherently subjective because you can take so many different perspectives on the economy. Like, who do we care about within the economy? What are the objectives that we have for the economy? And while that is a challenge, it's one of the things that I really like about it. It's one of the things that I feel like I could add to. And in this book, I'm trying to present a different perspective than what most people see when they think of economics. So after graduate school, I went into consulting for 2 years. I absolutely hated it. I just felt like it didn't really align with my skills. It was a very perfectionist culture, long hours being at the desk. And I was really upset. I thought that, if I got a raise, it would make me happier. But after asking for a raise and getting rejected, I just realized that my only path was to find a different job. So I left that consulting job and I went to go work for Amazon for 2 years, where I studied employee engagement. So I was looking at the relationship between employee performance and their satisfaction at work. I got promoted to senior economist while I was there. And then after going on maternity leave, I got called up by a recruiter at Redfin. And shortly after I ended my maternity leave, I applied for that job. I got the job, and I've been working at Redfin for the last 7 years as their chief economist. And at Redfin, I study the housing market, and really, I just study the whole entire economy because the housing market is so fundamental to the economy. It's so fundamental to people's personal economic lives that it just interacts with so many different things, which makes my job really interesting. And I wrote this book. And the reason I decided to write the book was because I felt like even though I had left academia, I was still using so much of what I learned in graduate school in my everyday life. And I wanted to share these lessons that I found really useful for my own career and for my own personal life with everybody who might not be so familiar with the concepts of economics and game theory.
Amazing. Well, we're really excited to jump into it because I think you bring up a really great framing. One, I mean, pressure from parents to start with in terms of your decision to actually to begin your journey across economics with data and subjectivity, right? So really all about framing the conversation and what that means for really the state of the global economy, but at a much more micro level, what it means for us as individuals. And I want to talk about that. Maybe we start data, right? And that economic insecurity just as a stage, because what I've found, what we find few and more in previous roles, is we've been asked historically to show us the data, right, when it comes to inequity in the workplace, right? We hear from so many organizations, let's make the business case. And I've definitely stood on stage and beat that drum. We have to make the business case. We have to make the business case. We have to make the business case. Here we are years later. We have so many data points that actually prove, one, systemic inequities are in fact real, and a tremendous barrier, and it's still not enough, right? So how do we actually get into those practical steps? So I really just want to set the stage more broadly and ask you, how does economic insecurity really influence our career and life decisions? Now, that's loaded questions, but you cover really across the gamut in your book. So what is the largest, I think, the underlying factor that economic insecurity will influence?
Sure. Well, one concept I talk about in the book is the concept of having inside options and outside options. So if you are deciding whether to stay at your current job or pursue another job, your inside option would be staying in your current role, and your outside option, or your best outside option, would be that great job that's potentially waiting for you if you go out and apply for these new jobs. The issue is, though, that if you don't have a safety net, if you don't have family to fall back on, if you don't have, savings to fall back on, that outside option is going to look a lot riskier. You're not exactly sure, what that job could be. If you're actually able to get the job, you might not be sure how long you might need to spend searching for that job. And that can hold people back, especially if they don't have that safety net of either family or savings. So if you are lower socioeconomic status, you are going to be less likely to take on economic risks, and risk equals reward, right? So inherently there is that inequality where people who have a safety net are going to be able to take more risks, and they're going to be able to accelerate their career faster than somebody who is risk averse because they don't have anything to fall back on if things don't go their way.
Absolutely. We talk about this in previous conversations also, is the fear, right? The fear of not only starting something new, but even more internally. If you're already in a role, the fear of asking for more, right? And we think about pay inequity, for example, which you deep dive into. We'll pull this number. In 2022, the income of people in the top 10% of earners was 13 times higher than those in the bottom 10%. And we can chalk that up to many factors. I'm curious, from your perspective, how do we start to navigate the conversation ourselves in terms of where we are today, and how we can either ask for more or start to identify where, if you are being paid fairly or unfairly?
Yes, one thing I talk about in the book is understanding not only your own inside and outside options, but the inside options and outside options of the person that you're negotiating against. So if you are an entry-level employee and your resume is pretty blank and you're asking for more pay, it's going to be hard for you to get that pay because there are many people that might be willing to step up and take your job. So if you're negotiating against your boss's outside option would be to hire somebody else, and their inside option would be to pay you more in order to keep you. And the more other people there are who could do that job and would be willing to do it for maybe even less than what you're asking for, the harder it's going to be to negotiate. The way you can to get better negotiating power is to get more skills and make yourself more unique. In economics, we call this a differentiated product. An undifferentiated product is one where, it's pretty similar to everything else, like Coke and Pepsi. It's basically the same. There's not anything special about it. A differentiated product is one that is more unique, and therefore you have like this little monopoly over your special uniqueness, your special skills. So the more skills you get, especially if those skills are ones that aren't very common, the easier it is going to be for you to negotiate. Because when you go to your boss and ask for more money, your boss isn't going to have great options. They're going to be essentially pretty screwed if you leave, because there isn't anybody else who could do the job that you can do if your skills are really unique. That can involve going to school. It could involve getting different job opportunities. It could involve doing work outside of your everyday job, like work in a nonprofit or volunteering. Anything that can build your skill set is going to give you more negotiating power over your career.
Skills, the age old, I feel like it's become exaggerated is not the word. It's overinflated. Everyone is talking about it, but no one's really giving us the answers. How do we actually develop these skills, right? So we see in organizations themselves, largely, right, the largest skills development assessments or understanding where you are, the value you bring, are largely centered around the goals of individual companies, right? What it takes for you to succeed at the Coca-Cola company, what it takes for you to succeed at PepsiCo, not necessarily what it takes for you to succeed, period. And that's a lot of work that we are trying to tackle here at Workview. So I'm curious, I'm going a little bit out of order of our prep. I hope that's okay. But from your perspective, in terms of skills and personal skill development, what advice do you have, in terms of seeking new skills, identifying where you are there any tools that you're using right now or kind of advice that you have throughout your career to take on and one, identify your own skills gaps, but two, then actually filling those gaps?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are skills that are going to serve you really well at a certain company specific skills. And accumulating those kinds of company specific skills can get you promoted, but it can actually do you a disservice. Like in my consulting job, had I stayed on that path and become an excellent consultant, it could have gotten me promoted, but it would have been harder and harder for me to leave that path behind and pursue something else. Getting more general skills or skills that you can take to other companies actually allows you to have more options and more opportunities. And it means that you're not so tied to just one company. And that gives you more power because you have these other outside options. You're not only tied to this one company and their company specific skills. I think in this age, when things are changing so quickly with technology, it's really hard to, have a clear idea of this is the skill that's right for everyone. So what I tell, young people who ask me for career advice, like what skills they should develop, is to follow their interest. And when I first started my career, the job of chief economist at Redfin was not on my radar. It was like not even something that I knew about. And there was only one previous chief economist at Redfin before I got there, and she was only in the role for a couple of years. So it wasn't even something that I would have been able to identify and say, I'm going to get the skills to get that job. But I knew that I liked public speaking. I knew that I liked communicating. I knew that I liked writing. And those were skills that I could get in my current job and skills that I could develop online or, in my own interests and my own hobbies. Another piece of advice I give people is that whatever you do it publicly, because you might not, like, part of finding the right opportunity, it's a matching problem. There might be somebody out there who needs somebody just like you, but they don't know how to find you. And if you're posting what you're doing, whether it's a hobby or the things you're doing in your job on something like LinkedIn or on social media, it just becomes much easier for the people who want someone just like you to find you. So yeah, I think that, like, back in the day, people would say, learn how to code, that's going to be a guaranteed job. Obviously, that's not true anymore because AI has substituted for some of those skills. So finding something that's really unique to you and your passion and your skill set, you're going to be able to commit to developing those skills because you're passionate about it. And because it's something that you uniquely are passionate about, you're going to be able to find something that makes you special that nobody else can fill. And that, I think, is going to give you more negotiating power over your career than just following what the herd is doing.
Amazing. Thank you. We talk about this quite a bit. I'm not to, shameless plug for Workview, but a lot of our conversation is about this idea of a shift skill. So thinking through all of the skills that you wouldn't necessarily put down in a resume that you have attained throughout your early career or even through education if you're just starting your career, and through your life. So thinking about how you're balancing your time and executive presence, all of these components that can actually apply across multiple roles. So we find it's really important to help hone in on what those shift skills actually are, so then you can advocate for yourself, like you said. I love in terms of advocacy, I love the advice of talking about what you're doing. A couple of weeks ago, we had Zara, who introduced us when I were at an event by a professor, author, Shiris Shalazi, who wrote a game across the gender pay gap as well. And in her personal life, she's a personal trainer. And we talked about, in the networking session, we talked about how are you doing all of this and also leading your own, fitness entity. And the woman that we were speaking to in turn was like, well, actually, you are all doing these amazing things. You're just not talking about it, right? If you stop and think about all the amazing things that you are doing in your day-to-day and amplifying that applies to that skill development across the board. So advocacy is absolutely key. And when it comes to skills and development, I mean, that's a perfect segue into meritocracy, right? This is our favorite looming word across the, skewed political landscape. We're seeing pushback on equity and inclusion programs across organizations. And you write about the meritocracy myth as a chapter in your book. For those of us who don't know, meritocracy essentially is the idea that we should just give the job to whoever is best for it. But we would argue that that's not always the reality in which we are living, right? Not everyone is starting from the same level playing field. So can you talk a little bit about how, I guess just more broadly, let's talk about the meritocracy myth and kind of your perspective on that. And then more specifically, we'll get into some of the measurements of success in terms of skills.
Yeah, I think even just the premise of meritocracy, it implies that there is some group of people in charge of deciding who gets opportunities, and they are able to identify who is best suited to those opportunities. But I think that premise is flawed to begin with, because everybody has biases, right? And even choosing what are the criteria for which somebody gets a promotion or for which somebody gets a job, bias is going to creep in there. So I fundamentally don't believe that, if you have a job open and there's a committee of people deciding who gets that job, that those people are going to be able to identify based on objective criteria who's going to be the best suited for that job. There's going to be a lot of subjectivity in deciding who gets the job. There are things like company fit. There are things like who gets even the job interview. A lot of that depends on networking and who your connections are. And also, people might be trying to fill a position based on somebody who held that position before because they did a great job in it, but they don't really have a great view of how the landscape is changing and how they might need somebody different with a different set of skills for that job. So just in terms of like getting the job, I feel like there is a lot of subjectivity in terms of determining who gets it. And the bias creeps in too. Like if, the person who had the job before went to an elite Ivy League school, then maybe they're going to seek out somebody who, with those same credentials and not consider people of different backgrounds. I feel like there's a lot of cultural bias too, in terms of how people speak or how they present themselves, where bias can creep in. And also in economics, there's this concept called the principal agent problem, where if say a manager of a job is deciding who gets a promotion, they're going to have some objective criteria, like how many reports did this person complete. But it's easy for somebody to game that system and kind of present an exterior that makes it look like they're the most qualified for the job, but maybe there are more subjective criteria that are harder to measure that somebody else is doing really well at, because it's not measurable. They're not the ones who get that promotion. So I feel like just because everybody has their own personal motivations and their own personal perspectives on who is deserving of promotions or of jobs, there's going to be bias inherent in that process that we have to acknowledge. And it shows up in the data too, how you can see how there's the gender pay gap, there are racial pay gaps, and sometimes people try to dismiss that as being like women only like particular jobs or women care about family more. But I feel like this just inherent flaw in terms of how people are identified for opportunities has a lot to do with it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's, we are hearing a lot across demographics, a lot of pushback of just complaining, just be happy to be here, rather than you should be happy to have me here, right? And thinking about that internal empowerment. So you talk a bit about, how do we navigate the game realistically? That's the framing of the book and across your own journey. You talk about game theory, you talk about cheat codes. How would you boil that down, right? Game theory is a very broad topic, but how are you applying that across some of the cheat codes, right? Where do we start in terms of, if we had to boil down or define game theory to the audience, what would you say?
Game theory, it's basically the building blocks of economics and the economy. So in the housing market, for example, you have a buyer of a home and a seller of a home, and they will engage in a negotiation to determine what the sale price is. That negotiation can be modeled using game theory. The buyer, they have the inside option of buying the home, but they also have outside options of going to some other seller and making an offer on a different home. Same with the seller. They have the inside option of taking the offer, or the outside option of rejecting the offer and waiting for another buyer to come along. And usually the way that negotiation goes is whoever has better outside options has more negotiating power, and they're the ones who are able to dictate the terms. So if it's a buyer's market, that means that the buyer has lots of other homes for sale that they can look at, and therefore they're going to be the ones who are able to determine the price more so than the seller. If it's a seller's market, there are lots of buyers available for a home, and if they reject this offer, they know another offer will come, and therefore the seller can get the highest offer for the home. And these negotiations that happen between buyers and sellers, when they add up across an entire housing market, you get what's resulting is home prices. Like when there's more of a seller's market, we see the median home price across the entire nation go up. When it's more of a buyer's market, we see the price fall. So these little negotiations all collectively together determine prices for the entire economy. That's also true for employee and employer negotiations. When you're negotiating with your boss, you're determining your personal wage or you're deciding to quit. But everybody is engaging in these negotiations either explicitly or implicitly, and that adds up to wages for the entire economy. When the labor market is weak, employers have more power and wages fall. When the economy is doing better and there are lots of job opportunities, employees have more power and they can negotiate higher salaries. We saw this during the pandemic, how everyone was like, nobody wants to work anymore. And for the first time, employees were like getting higher and higher pay because they were the ones having better negotiating power. That you felt that when you were negotiating with your boss. And now that the economy is weaker, it's much more difficult to negotiate for higher pay because job opportunities are more scarce and employers know that. So understanding like where you fit in the economy can also clue you into how much negotiating power you might have. But yeah, game theory shows up in so many different aspects of your own personal life. Negotiating with your marriage partner, for example, about who's going to stay home with the kids versus who is going to be able to take on more hours is a negotiation you have with your partner if you have kids. Negotiating in the housing market, like I spoke about, there are these little interactions. One example I go through in the book too is if you have a conflict at work where, say, somebody at your office is kind of bullying you, trying to get you to do more work or take on their work, or is trying to take credit for your work. That in and of itself is a type of game theory interaction where you either have to stand up for yourself or you bow down and kind of be more submissive. So these little kind of game theory interactions, they happen every single day. And once you understand the framework, I think you'll start to see it more and more and understand how to navigate those better.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the idea that if we think about it from the lens of our day to day, it makes it easier to tackle in terms of, it's I think to many hearing the phrase game theory, it's like, I'm not an economist. I don't know. I heard that once in college and that was it. So thinking about it in terms of day to day interactions is incredibly helpful. And you mentioned the state of the economy and the decisions we are faced with every day. We tackle not only workplace decisions, but thinking about labor, economics as a whole, and how that impacts your decision to leave, your decision to change, and what we're seeing in terms of layoffs and redundancies, for example. So there is this overarching fear, just given the state of the global economy right now. How do we take this one step at a time? How do we prevent ourselves from getting trapped in too much analysis when it's debilitating?
Yes, analysis paralysis. That's something that can definitely happen. It's in Hate the Game, I also talk about behavioral economics. My specialty in grad school is behavioral economics. So understanding those psychological biases can also help you make better decisions when you're playing these little games. For example, when deciding whether to ask your boss for a raise, you might have risk aversion. You might be afraid that they're going to say no and that you're going to be in this really terrible position and have to find a new job. If you're thinking about taking on a new job, you might have status quo bias. There's this natural inclination that humans have to kind of keep things the same, and people tend to reject better opportunities, even if like they might be better, just because they're uncertain compared to that sure thing that they're already in. So understanding these biases can help you kind of check them and help you kind of overcome these fears that you might have. Like, for example, one thing I talk about in the book is that if you are debating every single day, should I stay on my job? Should I leave? Should I stay on my job? Should I leave? Chances are that status quo bias is what's keeping you in that job. And you should at least start exploring those other options to overcome that bias that you know exists inside of you. Another one is the sunk cost fallacy. Oh, I've invested so much in this job. I've already made all of these relationships with the people at my work. If I went somewhere new, I'd have to start all over. But those are sunk costs, as we call them in economics. That means that you can't go back and undo them. They should have no bearing on what your decision is moving forward, because what you do moving forward can't reverse what's already been done. So understanding that sunk costs are sunk, you can't do anything about them, and only considering your future opportunities instead of what you've already invested is another way to break free of that status quo bias.
Amazing. And I think even shifting the lens and the sunk cost just a little bit and thinking through, I can't change what's been done, but also, practically taking a look at what value those sunk costs have added, right? You talk about it being an investment. You've invested in these skills that you've acquired over the X amount of years of your career or your life, wherever you are in your career. So if we shift the framing of, this is the loss to actually, I've invested this much, let me take it that much further. I think that's really, thank you for that. I think it's a great way to frame it moving forward. I want to remind the audience that we're open to questions, so please feel free to drop any in the chat. And then in the meantime, so we're thinking right now, we are focusing largely when we reimagine the future of work, what that means, even using the phrase future of work. We've been back and forth. It's like, should we name this series Future of Work? It's changing every day. What does that even mean at this point? But you talk about the rules of the game are changing, right? What are some of the biggest changes you've seen in terms of today's landscape, whether it be from a technological impact, from a political impact, really, or both? I'm curious your perspective on how would you define the future of work, and where are we seeing the largest needs for systemic change?
Yeah, I think that just in the last few years, we've definitely seen the rollback of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that presents a challenge for people like myself or people who are women or minorities in terms of the job opportunities that are available to them. It used to be that like companies would have a would want to interview at least somebody from an underrepresented group. And I feel like that goal is starting to fade. The companies aren't reporting as much on their diversity anymore. They're not setting it as a goal for their companies anymore, which is unfortunate because it limits the opportunities that might be available to women and minorities. But at the same time, it can be quite clarifying, right? The companies that are still putting diversity and inclusion first, you know that they weren't doing it just for political reasons, that it was something that was truly important for them. And it can be a big time waster to go and work for a company that claims to care about diversity. And then you get there and then you realize, oh, they don't really care at all. That was just something that they put on their website, but it wasn't something that they're truly committed to in terms of promoting people from within. So in one way, I think it's limiting, but also, yeah, it's clarifying in terms of these are the companies that can really be true to you. It can save you some time in terms of going to work somewhere that might not be right. I think another thing that's changing with artificial intelligence or generative AI or just technology in general is that it's getting harder for entry-level employees. Like we've seen the unemployment rate of college grads rise quicker than people who are more established in their careers because those entry-level jobs that were maybe about data cleaning or just about writing emails or something like that, they're becoming replaced by AI. But again, that can be very limiting in terms of the opportunities and the amount of entry-level jobs, but it can be clarifying for people to start focusing on skills that AI can't do. Like in the field of economics, one thing I've noticed is that we need fewer junior analysts, like people who are cleaning data, entering data, but we need more people who are managing that data because the AI can't do that on its own. Like the AI will read the data, but we still need somebody who's going to be storing that data in the database, making sure that it is organized in a way that the AI can actually read it. So there are some jobs that are going to be going away, but some jobs that are going to be created. And it's a bit scary, I think, for people who thought that they were going to have just this one career path that they envisioned for themselves. You have to be adaptable. I mean, it's like, it's Charles Darwin, right? The survival of the most adaptable. That's true in the economy as well. And I think going back to what I was saying earlier about focusing on skills that you are truly passionate about, I think that can make you more adaptable because it will make you less tied to just one predefined career path and more more tied to just finding something where you are adding value and that job is bringing value to yourself. And I think that allows you to pivot a bit more flexibly than if you are more rigid in terms of just fulfilling some path that used to exist.
We talk about tech as exactly as you said, as both an enabler and a disruptor, right? So there are actually incredible ways from a skills development perspective. You mentioned earlier, you don't necessarily need to know how to code today. And I don't want to discredit all of the coders out there. I absolutely, even with AI, I'm not a coder, so I won't undermine that. But knowing that there are tools to help advance in that way. But there is a fear. There's a fear from an entry-level perspective when you think about an engineering degree, for example. One of our council members has brought this up in the past is, it takes 4 years to get an engineering degree. And the world, I mean, what has changed in the world of tech across 4 years is the degree doesn't even look the same. What advice do you have for young professionals just starting their career that are faced with, oh no, I just spent 4 years on this degree focusing on one thing and now the world has changed? What advice do you have for them as they enter their career as kind of key themes that they should look for or different ways that they can kind of diversify their options?
Well, with artificial intelligence, it might mean that you're less able to get that entry level position, but I think on the plus side, it means that you don't necessarily have to do that entry level work straight out of college anymore. It might allow you to kind of jump over that step and move more to a higher level type of employee, or maybe even an entrepreneur. Maybe you could become an entrepreneur, because these skills, they're not, I mean, these AI tools are not just available to these large companies, they're available to basically everyone. So I think there are more opportunities for people to be more entrepreneurial, or potentially to work for firms that need people who have critical thinking skills as opposed to just repetitive skills. Because the AI is going to be good at those repetitive skills, but not good at those critical thinking skills. In economics, we categorize it as AI is good at predicting, but it's not good at judgment. There still are going to be need to people who look at what the AI outputs and judge whether or not it is correct or not, because we know that we can't just trust what the AI puts out blindly. So I think, if you have an engineering degree and you thought that you were going to be a junior employee at an engineering firm doing basic coding, those opportunities might not be available anymore, but maybe you can skip that step and start working on something that involves more of those critical thinking and judgment skills. It might be a bit harder because you won't have as stable as a path. And we talk about how that can actually hurt people who don't have that safety net compared to people who do. Obviously, not everybody can go become an entrepreneur because you have that time where you're not making very much money. But at the same time, I think that if I feel like it's easier now to move somewhere where there's a low cost of living and do things remotely and build that business without really needing as much infrastructure as we needed before. So there are definitely pluses and minuses. And I don't want to say everybody should be an entrepreneur, because I don't think that's true. But I think that you don't need to throw out that degree entirely. Hopefully, when you went to college, you didn't just learn how to do one specific thing. You learned how to think and have those critical thinking skills, which the AI is not going to be able to replace.
Absolutely. So thinking through, like we said earlier, it's not just the skills you might have on paper or might put down on paper that you've acquired throughout your learning. So how do we apply those across the board? I'll ask the same question actually for a mid-level career. So I know we're seeing significant layoffs across industries, redundancies across the board globally. Those companies that promised we wouldn't lay off after COVID, and now with the influence of technology and all of these components, we're seeing that happen. What advice would you have for someone mid-career that's looking, that feels stuck, that's looking to make that jump, whether it's a new career path or maybe it is entrepreneurship? Is it similar advice, or what would you say for someone kind of mid-level career looking to make that jump?
Yeah, my advice, I mean, it's going to go back to that fundamental thing about skills. Look at the job opportunities that you want that might be in a different career, and what is on those job postings. What are the skills where you have gaps? And then think through, how can I acquire those skills either in my current role or in opportunities that are maybe outside of my day job. So for example, if you wanted to make the jump from, I don't know, being a data analyst to being a manager. And those management skills require like learning how to have tough conversations. You could take on opportunities potentially at a nonprofit where you're doing more of those managerial skills. And I mean, I've hired people before. I really don't care if the skills were in a traditional job versus if they were skills that were acquired outside of a traditional job. What I mostly care about is, do you have those skills? And going back to what AI can and can't do, one thing that AI is never going to be able to do is talk to multiple groups of people with different needs and wants and evaluate the best path forward. We're hiring at Redfin right now a data engineer, and the data engineering part, that's like just the basic skill. Like if you're a proficient data engineer, great. Like if you can learn the specifics of the job on the job and increase those technical skills. But what we really need is somebody who's going to be able to talk to our data engineering team, talk to our economics team, talk to our program managers, and figure out what the priority should be between those teams, and then talk to their manager and have those tough conversations. So those kinds of people skills, and also just, I think, weighing different options and needs within a company is something that I think you can demonstrate, especially if you're mid-career, that you've already done, and that could be something that you can port into a new career. And if you have the basic technical background, that's fine. Like having those more soft skills or more judgment skills is what will set you apart and transfer across different career paths.
And how do we start to tackle, so we talk about individual development opportunities, right? How you can grow your skills, how you can seek out net new technologies, how you can, how the introduction of technology is allowing you to actually develop across a more, a broad skill set. But we know, as you write, and as many of us can attest to, the system seems rigged or is rigged, as we know. So we want to start to think about system changes that we can put in place and kind of approach. How would, as in thinking through the future, best case scenario, or if the world is your oyster, what new models can we start to think about to tackle a more fair workplace, right? How do we start to tackle some of those systemic barriers to progress?
Well, I think one of the things that holds back the labor market from being more equal is that employers just have so much power over their employees because their employees are fearful of getting fired. They're fearful of losing their health insurance. They're fearful of being able to pay their rent or their mortgage. So in my view, the thing that I would change about the economy to make it more fair is to increase the social safety net. Whether that, I mean, there are many different solutions that I would be perfectly happy with, whether that's universal basic income or rent relief or universal health care, but just making it so that when people lose their jobs, they're not completely screwed over. I think that will allow employees to push back on their employers more and call them out more when they do things that are unfair to them or to marginalized groups. It will allow them to have better negotiating power. It will allow them to take more risks, whether it be jumping to a new job or just advocating for a change. I think that fear of just being completely screwed over if your boss decides to fire you is what is really holding back us from having a more fair labor market.
Yeah. And having more open and honest conversations, right? There's so much power in a single person's hand. The insurance example, we use that time and time again. I mean, it's a global audience today, and some are in places with universal healthcare and some are in places that do not have universal healthcare. I'm sitting in New York right now. And I pay a ton of money for insurance in our attempt to be an entrepreneur, right? And taking on this work. And the thought of losing your job immediately, the first question I have is, well, how do I have insurance? Or do I just live without insurance? And that's not a possibility. So really thinking about realistically some of those policy changes, I think it's beyond just what we can do as people, what companies can do, but policy, it's a fine line between all of these three themes that we have to tackle.
One thing I forgot to mention there is that I know a lot of people will say, oh, it's great to have a greater social safety net, but how do we pay for it? And one of the things I talk about in the book is this concept of a land value tax. One thing that I've identified being a housing market economist is how unfair it is that somebody can just buy a home or inherit a home and then it increases in value without them actually doing anything. The land increases in value because the community gets better, right? If you buy a home in a city that is growing and, people are going to work every day, contributing to the economy, contributing to the tax base of their income taxes, but you could just buy a piece of land and wait for it to go up in value, that is unfair. And if we start shifting the tax burden from income or property development or sales tax onto just land, which is never going to change, you're never going to have less land just because you tax it. We actually can fund a lot of these social safety net programs that people claim that we don't have the money for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And all of these decisions across our career. I mean, we've been speaking at this from the lens of, or at least at Workview's perspective, from the lens of our career. But you're coming at this from every aspect of life, right? All of the decisions we make across our career that happen in real life. And we've used pay inequity example. We did an exercise in the past of a man and woman of the same race starting their career at the same salary rate. The time it would take the woman, given the pay gap at 89 cents on the dollar here in the US and comparable globally, the time it would take that woman to reach the salary of a man, even if she's outperformed, even if she's received more merit increases, would take at least 29 years. And that's exceptionally exacerbated when you look across marginalized communities. So women of color, men of color, and adding into those different components, just only exacerbating the gaps. And I bring that example up is because that's assuming they have made every single life decision the same, right? They're living in the same place. They have the same size family. We're not actually looking at any trade-offs there. So we know that that's only amplified with those trade-offs. Just a few minutes left. I want to kind of close out the discussion again, we have some questions from the audience around how we can develop our own skills. But as a community, right, we are talking about bringing power, purpose, and possibilities into the hands of individuals. So if you could give any advice from a community perspective, what we can do to do that, kind of what are some recommendations or advice you might have when we think about fostering a community of individuals that are looking to actually improve across these skills or improve on their, maps rather than just singular paths? What advice would you have?
Well, I think just acknowledging that there is not a single path. When I was earlier in my career, if somebody said no to me, I would internalize that as I'm not good enough for this opportunity versus this one person is closing the door to me, but there are so many other doors. So just opening up your mind to the idea that there are these other opportunities out there for you, I think can help somebody overcome rejection. And if you're, like you said, if your boss is a sexist or your boss is a racist and they tell you no, it might not have anything to do with your actual ability. It just means that you have the wrong boss and you need to go find a different boss. I recognize that it does put more of a cost on people who are facing these challenges to go out and find those opportunities. But I think that if you just have this mindset that just because somebody said no, I only need the one yes. If you get into the habit of that, then you're going to be able to advance your career a lot faster than somebody who just accepts the yes or no from their manager and accepts that that's the only path. So just opening up your mind to this idea, there isn't a single path, but there are these networks of paths that you can navigate across. I think that will enable you to find the fastest path to what you really want. And another part of that is to define what it is you actually value. I was talking in a different panel and somebody was talking about this person has so much more money than me, their career is so much more advanced than me. And I was saying, well, maybe they just value money more than you do. Maybe you care more about other things in your life, like your relationships with your family. And if that's what you value, just define that for you and doesn't feel like a failure anymore if somebody else is getting paid more than you. So you have to actually define your values in order to figure out what your goals are, and then you can move towards those goals in a way that feels true to you. It's not just that there is this one defined goal that everybody is reaching towards. There are many different versions of success out there, and if your definition of success is internal to you and not something external to you, then nobody can take that away from you.
That's very powerful. The definition of success is different across the board. And it's shifting that frame of thinking, right? The glass half full to the glass half empty to glass half full mentality, how we make that shift. So thank you for that. I know we're up on time. We can continue this conversation. Like I said, the book goes across not just the workplace, definitely into life and love and all of these different components. And we encourage just some key takeaways before I pass it back to Zara. Like I said, I have my copy here. It's blurred out, but you can see it behind Daryl as well. So we encourage you all to read the book. And I will just share my screen again briefly, just to share some of the resources we have at WorkView. Just again, we did publish the declaration for the future of the work on the most recent Equal Pay Day, which marks the time of year where women will start to work for free in comparison to their male counterparts, given the global pay gap. So we encourage you all to take a look at the Declaration for the Future of Work online and sign it, right? The signature is the first step to actually building a coalition to actually drive some of this change and continue to get to work with amazing people like Daryl and host these conversations about actual impact and actual action items we can all take home and start internally, start at our own desks, at our own tables, and then work to change those systems. So thank you, Daryl, for being here today. I know you're on what seems like a whirlwind tour from social media for I Hate the Game. So thank you for your time today. And again, apologies for the tech hiccup at the beginning. But Zara, I'll pass it back to you to close us out.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sabina, for steering us through this conversation beautifully, as always. And thank you very much, Daryl, for giving up your time and talking to us about these very important issues. Thank you for actually being that voiceful economist who brings a different perspective to the table. And as a mother of a 16, nearly 17-year-old, I made sure she has a copy of this book early on so that she can really understand a lot of these concepts and hit the ground running ahead of time. I'd love to stay in touch and hear more perspectives as you evolve in your journey as an economist. Thank you very much to our community for being here today. Our next event is in October. We will have as guest, I believe you are actually friends, Daryl, with Anna Giftiopoku Agyeman. She will be joining us to talk about her new book, The Double Tax: How Women of Color Are Being Underpaid and Overcharged. Thank you very much for being here today. We really appreciate your insight, and we'd love to stay in touch about making our world more fair, our economies more fair, and the workplaces more fair.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.